Hey folks, Dr. Mike Israetel here for Renaissance Periodization. Today's topic video is about how and when you should fix your technique during hypertrophy training. Let's take a look at what's on the menu specifically. First, we'll talk about why fixing technique is ever a good idea. There's some pretty convincing reasons there. We'll talk about a concept called technique stray. And it sounds like, what the heck is he talking about? But as soon as I explain it, you'll be like, okay, I know exactly what that is. And we'll talk about technique renorming. Newsflash, it's fixing technique that is strayed away from very good technique. We're going to talk about how to do it. We're going to talk about when to do it. We're going to talk about how to introduce new exercises properly into your program and thus adjust their technique. And we'll talk about what this means for tracking and making sure that you're keeping track of your strength for reps and making sure you're on track. So here is the deal. Why do we need to fix technique ever? Well, usually technique improvements in the context of hypertrophy training, and I mean improvements, not just changes, result in an improved SFR, stimulus to fatigue ratio. And the better your technique is, the more the improvement is in stimulus to fatigue. For example, use some kind of technique in squats. You're sitting back a little too far, you're rounding your back a little too much. That ends up, irritating your joints in your spine and your hips a little bit too much, and thus the fatigue is a little too high. You use a lot of weight to stimulate the quads, which again makes your systemic fatigue and your RPE a little bit high. With your quads, because you're sitting back and away from them, aren't getting stimulated as much as the stimulus is lower, the fatigue is higher. You fix your squat technique to where you're a little bit more upright, you're breaking at your hips and knees, and you're letting your knees come forward over your toes, not sitting back too much, sitting down and into your quads. All of a sudden, your quad stimulus is elevated, and the fatigue from the actual sort of joint and connective tissue disruption to your lower back is better, it's lower, and they use less weight to get the same reps, come as close to failure for the actual quads, and all of a sudden, your systemic contribution to fatigue is lower as well, so your stimulus is higher, fatigue is lower, and that kind of thing can occur for any exercise. Now, generally speaking, you would think, okay, I really sort of have figured out my squat technique, and but for a little play here and there, my curl technique, my press technique, and everything else should be pretty well in line. I've watched all the other RP technique videos. I know what I'm doing. My technique is good. And that's absolutely 100% true, except for every now and again, all of us get caught in the following phenomenon of technique stray. Once we have our good technique, all of us, because we're all egotistical and we want PRs, we also know how related rep strength is to hypertrophy gains. And because of the progression model that a lot of us use, which is to try to break mini PRs more or less every session from the beginning of a meso to the end, we're really driven to do better and better and better each session, which is a good thing. We never want to drop it. But this process of trying to do a little bit better, at some point, even if it's not consciously in your head, though sometimes it is, there comes a little bit of a trade-off between what is a really good technique to stimulate the muscle and what is a technique that allows us to get 5 pounds more in the same reps or 1 more rep added to the set. And if that happens a few times, it's no big deal. But over the course of half a year to a year, what started out as a good squat technique that really hit your quads over months of PR chasing might have started to morph a little bit more and more into a technique that just let you lift more weight, maybe without stimulating your quads as much and causing a little bit too much fatigue for that stimulus, right? And that basically comes from the idea of just getting the reps done versus having every rep meet the quality standards of the highest possible stimulus to fatigue ratio. It has to happen to almost everyone. It just happens at different rates. So your technique starts out excellent and super crisp, and it strays away over time into technique that usually isn't just randomly off. It's off to try to get you to lift more weight, but at the expense of stimulus to fatigue ratio for the target muscle. For technique stray, we have a concept to combat it, and it's called technique renorming. And that's when you drop all attachments to the usual loads and reps. And a lot of times this happens when you've done your 5th set of squats at the end of a meso and you're like, man, I hit a PR, but I swear to God, I don't even know what squats are doing for me anymore. Someone's like, your quads are hit up. You're like, I don't know. My back just hurts. I feel like I'm just lifting the weight. I got to be honest with myself. And then you drop all attachments to the usual loads and reps because you realize, like, for you to actually do a quad focused squat with good technique for that, there's no way you're going to be doing any remotely reps that you're doing currently. And the load, if you're going to do the same reps, has to be way, way lower. So you just drop all your attachments. So you know what? I'm clean slating my squat. I don't care what I squatted before for how many reps, so to speak. And I'm just going to go back to perfect technique or even better technique. not only are you sitting back less now, you might have widened your stance a little bit so you can sit more forward and down and really nail your quads. Like, you know what? I've watched other people do this technique I'm trying now. I knew it was better for my quads, but I was lifting more weight. I didn't want to stop lifting more weight. I'm just going to do this really, really good technique now. You forget all your old numbers. And this applies to a bunch of lifts. It applies to every single one, but just a few examples for you. The knees forward on squat example, we've already beat to death. Pausing on lateral raises. Sometimes you can get into this habit of swinging the laterals and you're maybe not pulling them as high. If you start pausing them at the top for a second and pause at the top, it gets rid of a ton of technical error and really fries your delts. But gee, you got to drop a lot of weight or a lot of reps off. That just has to happen. You got to cut that ego out. Pull downs and lean. Sometimes we take an athletic lean into pull downs at the bottom to put our chest up and really crunch our lats in the back. But sometimes that tends to get into where you're starting to lean on purpose to swing the weight down. And every now and again, you got to just forget what you're lifting, reps and weight, and just renorm your technique completely and do them much more upright with just a little chest lift. And it can be an ego hit if you accept it as one, but you don't have to, because this is a very good idea for hypertrophy. That's the whole point. Once you renorm your technique, you find a new technique, which really just takes about a session to be like, okay, this is my new technique, because you're an experienced lifter. You're used to doing this, used to lifting, and you know what good technique is. You've just strayed away from it. Once you've renormed it, then you can begin to push up loads and reps again just the same way, but really being careful to keep great tech. And look, you were careful before to keep great tech. It just strays every now and again. This doesn't mean once you renorm that you never have to renorm again. You'll have to renorm multiple times throughout your career, but it'd be good to renorm like once every year or 2 years versus like once every 2 or 3 months. So it's good to try to have as crisp technique as possible, but every now and again, renorming is a good idea, and it's okay if you have to do it every now and again. Now, how do we renorm and when do we renorm? Okay, so you only renorm, which is to say, change your technique to a pretty new technique, forgetting all the old loads and reps, if your SFR is clearly down or your externally viewed technique is clearly off. Okay, if your SFR is very good and externally people are like, dude, that's a baller hack squat, you got nothing to worry about, don't change your technique. You might, on the next set or on the next rep or on the next day, try a little bit harder to have really crisp technique. And in that way, you may never need to renorm because you're always on the ball. But a lot of folks get to this perfectionist thing and they try to renorm like every other week. Like they do a hard set of incline bench and then like sort of they say, oh, it kind of feels off. Next week, I'm just going to focus on mind-muscle connection and perfect technique. And they use this kind of as a crutch, sometimes intentional, sometimes not, kind of as an excuse to get away from hard training. Like at the end of the day, once you have a good technique, muscle growth comes from pushing the sets hard, close to failure, and progressively increasing the amount of weight, the amount of reps you're doing over weeks and weeks. If you renorm all the time, you're essentially going up, up, down, up, up, down, up, up, down, and you never really get to pushing yourself hard because you're paranoid that your technique isn't perfect. Technique never needs to be perfect. It needs to just be very, very good. If it's already very, very good, do not renorm. Don't do it, right? So this is a process that should only be really needed once or twice a year for most folks. A little bit more often if your technique is slipping, but it's another problem. If your technique slips so much that you need to renorm every month, you have to work on just session to session, making sure you have good technique. That is going to solve a lot of your problems. But for everyone, or almost everyone, renorming every now and again is a good idea. We just want to have such good technique and such consistency that we don't need to do it too often. And if your shit is already really, really good, don't renorm out of sheer paranoia. This happens a lot. Don't let it happen to you. Now, here's the thing. When to renorm has a constraint. It might take a whole session to experiment and find your best tech again. You don't simply like stop doing a hack squat warm up one session, let's say in microcycle 4 of a 5-week accumulation, like hard train. Today's a hard day. You don't simply go, okay, I'm going to do new squat technique today, new hack squat technique, and get a really good hard workout, because it takes usually a session to practice with much lighter weights, not close to failure, your new technique that you're settling in. Your brain learns that. And then next time you can start slowly going up and up and up, right? So we don't just want to do this randomly in the middle of hard training. So that means overload is really only going to occur 2 sessions or later. And thus we have some rules for when to renorm. And none of these are hard rules, they're soft rules, which means the more of them you apply, the better. If you don't apply 1 or 2, that's okay. So generally speaking, we want to renorm perhaps at the beginning of a mesocycle, and during a deload is a really good idea. New exercise technique during a deload, there's no pressure for you to do well. You can just focus on the technique and the deload handles itself. This is no requirement for overload to begin with. If you're not doing it during deload especially, and even if you are, you want to renorm second or third exercises. You still want your first or second exercises in a session to be hard. And so you want to renorm an exercise, you can push it to an exercise that's like second or third or fourth in your training session so that you're not so, you're already tired, you already did the main work. Now you can just practice it a little bit. The requirement for overload is not that great, and you can use less weight, right? That's the second one. Or third one, use light weights, not heavy weights. You don't renorm a 405-pound squat by squatting 405 differently. You renorm a 405-pound squat by squatting 315 in the new style. And then in the next microcycle after that, you might go 365 for very controlled reps, and then 75, 85, 405, 15, 25, and then you're off, to the races. So another one is far from failure. You can't renorm sets that go close to failure because as you go close to failure, whatever new technique you're trying breaks down. So ideally, when you renorm, you want it to be, first of all, like 10 RIR. And second of all, the next workout after, and this is why during deload or at the beginning of meso is a great idea, you want that next workout to be maybe 3 reps in reserve, and then 2, and then 1. You don't want to do like a renorming technique session and the next workout is all the way to failure because your technique is very, very likely to break down. And rather than just breaking down, revert back to the old technique, obviating the entire purpose of renorming to begin with. Think of it this way. The first session of renorming is practice. The second session and after is incrementally higher and higher stimulus. So you're not trying to renorm and be like, oh man, great workout, which is counterintuitive, right? Someone would be like, hey, I heard you changed up your hack squat. Did it hit your quads a lot? You're like, yes, I think it will. I've practiced the new technique and it really feels like it's hitting my quads. I don't know about at higher reps close to failure and with heavy weight, but I'm sure as hell going to find out in the coming sessions, right? Because usually people be like, oh, I switched it up and it felt great. Not the best idea. You want to switch it up when it's submaximal so you have the play and experimentation to really move your body how you need to without worrying in the moment about, am I getting a great stimulus on every rep? Because that's another thing. If you start close grip benching and you're like, okay, every single one of these needs to hit my triceps, you may get locked into a technique or okay, good enough and I can keep going. If you're using light weights not to failure, there's no pressure for you to overload. You can do every rep a little bit differently and be like, like a 5th rep in, you're like, yes, this flaring the elbows this way really, really works for me. Now I'm going to try that actually overloading later when I've already had a couple more sets of practicing this technique. You do not want to rush in to renorming. It makes all of the benefits go away. So a quick example here. Let's say your close grip bench feels way off. Like you're just pushing the weight at this point. Someone's like triceps. You're like, I don't know, joints. So what do? You finish the mesocycle. Okay, so whatever meso you're in, finish with your good technique that you have now, good technique. Notice it's not great. And hit your PRs or whatever. Don't change it halfway through. Whatever you start with your meso, unless it's really hurting your joints or something, don't just stick with the technique and just try to do it pretty well, right? But don't like throw away all your numbers and renorm in the middle of a meso. Finish up. And this rule right here, this recommendation, gets rid of a lot of that sort of paranoia-driven renorming that people do, whether they're meso, they're microcycle 2 of a meso and they're like, oh, I need to change up my incline. Like, don't do that, okay? Just keep doing what you're doing. Just try to do it really well. Switch to incline close grip, different exercise in the next meso. So that's your primary, close grip pushing movement. No flat close gripping for an entire meso. The reason we do this is because we want the old technique to wash out a little bit. Your body tends to forget techniques. And when it's forgotten, a bad technique, introducing a new technique is more likely to take over and learn. Because if you're always doing a bad technique, a new technique just kind of gets sort of funneled in there, and it is very difficult to draw a difference between the two. Like if you're learning Spanish for a while, not speaking Spanish for a while, and then picking up French later is probably a better idea than learning Spanish, and then starting to learn French because all of it kind of mixes together. Not exactly a great analogy, but I think it conveys some kind of meaning. Next, after a whole mesocycle of not doing close grip, after that mesos, in that next mesos where you didn't do it, in that deload, you introduce close grip flat in the new technique, experiment with it during the deload as like a 3rd exercise or something. No pressure to do well at all. Find your new technique and practice it. And then in the next meso, you can reintroduce it as a 1st exercise again with the new tech, low reps in reserve, 3 or something like that, and then ease into it and go, and then eventually PRs. That's one way of doing it. Here's another example. Let's say your bent row feels way off. Like, you're meeting, like you're coming up and sort of swinging it. You're not feeling a whole much of anything. And some stuff is off. You need to clean it up to actually hit your back better. Finish the meso. Don't change halfway through. Same idea here. Next meso, your first movement, you're going to switch to dumbbell rows. Okay, so bent rows are gone. And in the end, just like the same way, in the end of this meso, you did no bent rowing, just dumbbell rowing. You introduced your bent row in the deload of that meso. So in the deload for the next meso, but in this next meso that you're doing it, so the meso, so you did meso of bent rows, they got crappy. Next meso, all dumbbell rows until that deload. Practice bent rows light. And then this next meso, you actually use bent rows, but as like a second or third exercise. So you're not cranking super crazy PRs. Because you have an exercise or two before that really smashes the back, maybe some one-arm rows or some pull downs or pull-ups, you can focus a little bit more with lighter weight on the bent row and really get your technique crisp when it doesn't have the pressure of being a first high-performance exercise. And then after that meso, bent row is crisp, it's great, you've had a whole meso of practice and it's put on some muscle for you. The next meso, you again rotate into the first exercise, keeping your new crisp technique, and then everything is hunky-dory. Now, new exercises, how to introduce them, and how to deal with the tracking component, all right? So you don't have to, when you start new exercises of any kind or renorm, start them during the deload. You can just start them in meso 1, microcycle 1 of the meso, the first week. But it's a good idea, so give it some thought, and there's really no downsides. And especially if you know it's an exercise that really takes some time to get some wind under your sails. Some exercises are so simple, like machine presses or exercises that you're really good at, you really know what you're doing. You just start them in week 1 and you're good to go. Other exercises, just new ones, not even renorm ones, the first session always kind of sucks and you need to play around with it. Like upright rows, your first session is always like, I don't even know where I'm going. But if you do it during a deload, that frustration is during the deload, and then you do some learning. And at the end of the deload, you're like, okay, I figured out my bar path again. I hadn't done it in a while. And then in the microcycle 1 of the next meso, it's gravy, it's stimulus right away. So that way you don't have to waste a session finding your footing. That first session can be stimulative. You find your footing during the deload. Not a must, but not a terrible idea. Now, what about tracking? Because the renorming took some weights and reps that we were building up like this and just went, right? And we have to nuke those numbers, because if we stay attached to them, there's no way renorming is going to happen. A lot of times, changing your technique for bodybuilding purposes, for hypertrophy purposes, actually reduces your performance, because you're no longer using your body as a machine to lift as much weight as possible, using it as a machine to stimulate the target muscle as greatly as possible. For example, on dumbbell flies, to lift the most weight, you might be cutting your range of motion and bringing your elbows in. Renorming might take your elbows out and make you go deeper. You've just lost a shitload of weight in reps. What are you supposed to do? Look back and be like, oh, guess I got to do the 50s again for 10s, but with your new technique, the 40s for 10s are tough. There's no way to reconcile that, so you have to nuke your old numbers. Right? That doesn't mean you erase them out of your notebook, but you just got to look at them and take them with a grain of salt. Okay, that was for that technique. Now we have a renorming. It's like they do with Olympic weightlifting records. Every 5 or 10 years, they just cut all the records off in the world records, clean them out, and then there's new world records, so people have to accomplish them fresh, sort of with drug testing or something. I don't know. So here's the deal. Your first meso, after you renorm, okay, the new technique is a wash to compare to previous mesos, okay? So don't be like, oh man, my squat went down by 40 pounds. Yeah, no shit, you were on purpose doing that, okay? So don't worry about it. You didn't get weaker or something like that. You had a great meso of stimulating the target muscle much more than you were, because, your old technique was really, really crappy. Now, the second meso and on, you can start to compare more to your previous mesos, a little bit, but you can definitely compare it to your last meso. So just the first meso, you went up from squats you usually squatted 405 plus for reps. Now you squatted 365 to 385 in your first meso. Okay. In your second meso, still great technique. The new technique, you go from 375 to 395. Now that is really, really good for comparisons. And then the comparison PR train gets rolling, and it keeps going for multiple mesos, multiple blocks, a few macrocycles, so on and so forth, right? Now, some big renorms might still be way off in performance even months later because of the nature of the difference that you actually imposed, though they are much better in the stimulus to fatigue ratio, so it's still okay. For example, your squat max for 10s might have dropped by 50 pounds. Okay, with a new technique. And how long is it going to take you to put 50 pounds on your 10RM in the squat? It take like 2 years. So you'd be like, yeah, I used to squat 405 for 10s. Now I'm squatting 335 for 10s, but my quads are just screaming at me way more. I know it's better. It's a big ego hit, but you got to take it if you want what's best for your body for hypertrophy results. And you might notice, okay, if we're renorming, how the hell are we supposed to keep track of long-term strength increases, which are the key to keeping track of muscle growth? Well, this is why tracking multiple exercises is always better than just one. People say, oh, I'm doing my RM test on squats to see if my quads grew. Hold up. You should be doing RM tests at the end of every mesocycle, the peak of accumulation, on all of your leg exercises, all of your quad movements. And if they're all going up and in the right direction, you're onto something. So people will say, oh, my squat dropped by 50 pounds, but I'm hitting massive PRs on my leg press. My hack squat's sky high compared to anything it ever was. So is my lunge. So is my leg extension. Look, if your hack squat and leg press and lunge and leg extensions are all in the stratosphere better than ever before, and your hack squat's down 50 pounds, but you know it's because you renormed the technique to have a better mind-muscle connection and not lift as much brutal weight as you could with your back. Now you're lifting more with your legs. Are you really going to look at that squat and be like, man, I must be getting smaller because my squat's down? No way. Because all of your other lifts are up. I'll tell you guys this. If you're actually getting weaker or smaller, rather, if you're getting smaller muscles, all of your lifts are going to be down across the board. But if almost all of them are up or all of them are up, but the lift you renormed is down, it can be down for months and years, and you shouldn't care about it. You should just care about once the renorming occurred, is it trending back up now at its own slow and steady pace, and all the other exercises doing well. That's it. Folks, give this some thought, shoot some questions for your other viewers and other experts on YouTube into the comments below. And if you guys want me to take on any new intellectual topics and talk about any intricacies, how do we do this? How do we do that? What about this concept? Maybe you've heard someone else talk about a concept. I can address it in these little informational videos going forward. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.